topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Elise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program, which has been brought to you with passion and pride since February of 2015. Thanks for tuning in again this week. Great to have you. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. If we have not met before and you don't know me, I'm an organizational psychologist, management consultant, logotherapist, speaker, and author. And my team and I at Gusto now help companies to enliven and fortify their operations by building a dynamic, high-performance culture and inspirational leadership activated by meaning and purpose. And did you know that inspired employees outperform their satisfied peers by a factor of 2.25 to 1? In other words, inspiration is good for the bottom line. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at gusto-now.com or my personal site, elisecortez.com. Now, getting to today's program, we have with us today Howard Lewis, the host of Offline, a gathering of about 35 clever, engaging, interesting people over dinner. He is also the director of the Shore Collection, a privately owned art collection principally focused on old masters, but also embracing 19th and 20th century paintings, prints, books, and other categories. And he also writes on various subjects, including art, travel, football, and other affairs of the day. And he also has his book out, Leave Your Phone at the Door, which was just a delight. We'll be talking about his offline philosophy and how we can embrace it in everyday life. He joins us today from London. Howard, a hearty welcome to Working on Purpose.
Well, good afternoon. Lovely to be with you.
It's already my day's better, as I told you before we got online, because I'm with you.
Well, that's obviously a good start. I can commend that. Let's hope it actually goes better from this point rather than somehow plateauing. So anyway, I'm in your hands entirely, Eddie, so fire away.
All right. Well, let's start just off with really who you seem to be about, as far as I know you so far. You have this whole offline philosophy, this Leave Your Phone at the Door book that you've written that I've read. By the way, it was delightful to read that book, Howard. There was so much. To me, what I get from you is you are a man who is going about the business of life and dancing with every little moment that you can as you go along. That's what I've gotten from you so far.
I think that's actually a fairly respectable summary. I think that certainly I am very inclined to embrace life for good and for bad. I think the reality of the matter is that most people are a little bit too scared about what may go wrong rather than concentrating on what may go right. And I accept things go wrong because that's life. Mm-hmm. But I don't agonize over the small stuff. I just think somehow if you take a bit of a chance, you're more often than not surprised on the upside. And it happens to me again and again. Actually, I related a story to a friend of mine this morning about an incident about 3 months ago, a bit less. I was on the subway in London and the compartment was fairly empty and the door opened and literally 25 kids all pile on with a couple of teachers in tow. And there was a seat next to me, empty. This boy sits down, probably about 11, 12, Indian boy. Puts his bag down, he turns to me directly, looks me in the eye and says, "And how's your day been so far?" Which was what an interesting question. I thought, actually, my day's been actually very good. How about yours? And he said, wonderful. He said, we're just coming back from a school outing to a place called the Globe. I don't know if you're aware. The Globe Theatre is the original theatre where Shakespeare's plays were performed, originally built in 1599. It was reconstructed essentially and rebuilt in that Elizabethan style about 50 odd years ago. It's still an amazing structure. You can go and they have plays, it's all outside, a fascinating format. Anyway, we chatted about the building and when it was constructed, a little bit about Shakespeare, whether he'd read any of his plays. And probably after 5 minutes, he got off, they left to take another line. But I thought to myself, in that 5-minute spell, there actually was hope for humanity. Here was a kid who did not at the first opportunity look at his phone, play a video game, stare at the floor, be disengaged. He actually was curious enough to ask me, and I just felt, he was 11 or 12, I should give him sufficient respect to ask him about his day with the same level of interest. And for that 5-minute spell, I thought to myself, wonderful. In a world where it seems that every other child is completely consumed and obsessed with technology and using mobile devices, here was a boy, albeit for a short period, who actually was more concerned with engaging people around him. So that to me was very uplifting in a way. Now, in a slightly different context, I want to share with you an interesting story, which I think in some ways encapsulates offline, probably my own view of the world more generally. So about 2 years ago, I was in South America. So my girlfriend and I did a big trip. We basically went to Brazil, to Argentina, and to Uruguay. And a very good friend of mine in New York, a Brazilian friend, said, by the way, if and when you get to Rio de Janeiro, you should hook up with a friend of mine. I think you've gone very, very well. He's a bit older than you, but he's an interesting guy. He's into football, he's into art, he's into world affairs. I just think you're going on very well. I thought, great, okay, fine, no problem. We'll see where it goes. So we exchanged a few WhatsApp messages, and we agree to meet at some beach bar on Ipanema, I remember. Anyway, gets down there. I've got no idea what to expect. In shop was this old black guy, very casual, t-shirt, flip-flops. Sits down, we get a drink. 2 hours fly by. Fascinating. So much so he said, look, it's been great meeting with you. I'd love to see you again. Can we get together maybe with our partners in a couple of days? Because obviously we're traveling. I said, yeah, well, we did, as it happens. Anyway, I had to get back to meet my girlfriend for supper. It was early evening by this point. I wanted to go for a shave, to go to a local barber. He said, I'll take you somewhere nearby. I said, we're getting lost. Anyway, we're walking down, and I didn't know anything about his professional career at all, except for the fact he was a lawyer. We didn't discuss business in any shape or form in the preceding 2 hours. Anyway, I say to him, I gather you're a lawyer. And he said, yes. And I said, any particular speciality? He said, my thing actually is constitutional law. And I thought, wow, I don't hear that very often. Plenty of people doing matrimonial or doing real estate or corporate, but constitutional law? That's uncommon. I said, in what capacity? Were you maybe a partner in a major law practice? Were you running a think tank? He said, no, not that kind of thing. He said, I was the public prosecutor. I thought, oh, really? Keep talking. We'll weave your way through a crowd outside the street. What emerged then and subsequently is that in 2002, this guy, his name is Joaquim had been appointed a member of the Supreme Court in Brazil by Lula the first time around. Mm-hmm. One of the first things he does when he takes office, he presses charges against 42 of Lula's entourage. For corruption, money laundering, racketeering, intimidation, puts them all away, puts them in prison. Now, clearly a formidable operator. 2013, Joaquim is appointed president of the Supreme Court, arguably the most powerful lawyer in the entire nation. Now, there were two remarkable consequences of this particular story. As you're probably aware, at least, Brazil, Argentina, a few other places in that region are still essentially run by a white elite.
Yes.
Joaquim was the first black president of the Supreme Court in the history of Brazil.
Wow.
Remarkable story in a way. He was the son of a bricklayer, to give you a bit of context. It's a remarkable story in a way of social mobility. How actually everything is available to everybody if they actually choose to make the effort and to look hard enough. Occasionally to ask questions along the way if they need a bit of guidance, a bit of help. Anyway, I have a conversation subsequently with my friend in New York. My friend in New York is younger. He's probably in his mid-40s. And I said, how do you know each other? What's the connection? He says, you should ask that. He said, when I was a young guy, I did my law degree at UCLA in California. He said 1 year over the duration of my course, Joaquim was there as like a visiting fellow, something like jurisprudence. I'm not quite sure what it was. He said he didn't teach me, but I knew who he was. And it turns out that one day we are standing in a very long line on the campus in a queue, basically with a drinks machine. We are two Brazilians side by side in this long snaking line. Not only that, we're both standing there, we're both wearing the same Brazilian football shirt.
Yeah.
And he said, we just connected. Obviously, I knew his background in generality. We stayed in touch. And after, obviously, I graduated, obviously, I came back to Brazil to do other things. And my friend is in New York, got married last year in Colombia. So it happens his wife is Colombian. And Joaquin was there, and I spent the day with him. It was great. Now, a really interesting guy on every level. And what I'm saying here, which is important, there could have been many reasons why I didn't meet him. It was the wrong side of town. It was the rush hour. I had to get a cab. There might be a bit of crime nearby. There were hawkers on the beach. The conversation might not be very interesting. I might like him. He might like me. All possibilities, but none of them significant enough for me to say, forget it. I'd rather sit here by the pool or just waste my, or not waste my afternoon, but at least let my afternoon drift by without doing very much. I went, I met him. It was great. We became very good friends. I met him at the wedding in Colombia. I'm seeing him in London in May when he comes over. I'm sharing that story really, at least simply because it really is all about the nature of randomness and serendipity. And those two tenets are really caught offline. If you take a chance, if you actually approach things with a positive spirit, more often than not, you'll be surprised on the upside.
Mm-hmm. How delightful. I welcome randomness and serendipity too. And by the way, in case you were wondering why I was nodding as vigorously as I was, is I lived in Rio de Janeiro for 2 years. I know Ipanema. I also lived in Spain. I love Argentina and Uruguay. Ainda falo português. I still speak Portuguese. So there's a lot of beautiful things that I'm connecting on that. And you did a beautiful job, of course, in opening our conversation about just the splendor that's available to us when we can walk the planet and be able to enjoy some serendipitous moments without an agenda or an expectation.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that in a way, I think that one of the challenges of the technology today is it limits people. And there is a much greater fear about what may go wrong rather than what may go right. And I just feel somehow that the technology inhibits people, it limits them, it imposes all kinds of boundaries. Mm-hmm. And I think what it does do above all else is that it actually takes away that which is most human. Mm-hmm. And really, what I mean by that is the kind of physicality, which means we are, in a sense, reminded of who and what we are. And I think that machinery, whether it's a laptop, an iPod, or whatever, it creates a distance. And people almost retreat into a private world where actually they're not going to be challenged. Nothing will be difficult or demanding. And I just feel fundamentally that that's a mistake. Mm-hmm. It's a big mistake. You need, in a sense, to be stretched. You need to have somebody question you. You need somehow to be invited to step a little bit out of your comfort zone. And there's not enough of it today.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things I like to do that you might endorse, Howard, and I do this all the time. One of my values is empowerment. Of course, that's what I do partly in my work, but I love to celebrate love. And when I'm out in public and I see couples actually connecting and talking and being with each other, I oftentimes will come approach them and come celebrate that with them. And part of the reason I do that is because I know that when you celebrate and give love attention, it grows. So just as a simple example, I was out with my daughter and her boyfriend some time ago. We were having a very nice dinner at an Italian place before we went to go see the symphony across the street afterwards. And I noticed the couples that were actually talking. And one in particular was sitting right in front of us the whole time. And they were talking the whole entire time that we were there for dinner. There was no cell phones present. And so I looked at my daughter. She says, yeah, I know you're going to go talk to them. Just go do your thing. And so I got up and I came over to the table and I said, excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt. Of course, I do mean to interrupt just a smidge. But I said, I couldn't help noticing that you have been enjoying each other the whole time that we've been here. Are you new together? And they said, no, we've been married 25 years. And I turned to the woman and I said, what do you love about this man? And she said, I can be completely myself with him. Now I turned to look at the man to ask him, and I can see he's starting to get emotional. So I put my hand on his shoulder and I say, what do you love about this woman? And he said, I can't imagine starting any day without her. And so we got to just sort of be together, the three of us, in this beautiful moment of intimacy, connecting and enjoying each other. And me, I wanted to celebrate their connection and their union and let them understand that it inspired me, that I saw it, that it moved me. And I do this all the time, Howard. This is something that I do everywhere I go. People always ask me, does anybody ever punch you in the face or tell you to go away? No, they never have. So that's one of my ways that I enjoy the serendipity and just the magic of the moment too.
Look, I think it's very important. I think, the difficult thing in a sense is that people have a tendency to overthink. In other words, you are spontaneous and you're very natural and you're very warm and so forth. For other people, they have those sensibilities, but somehow just getting to the point where they say, right, I'm going.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is actually the hardest thing. Once they're actually there, I used to have this with offline many times. I had people who came to offline, someone who'd never been before, they didn't know anybody, a bit different, a bit awkward, a bit shy. Yeah. And in a sense, I didn't worry terribly much about it. I just knew that if you somehow created the right ambience, it was warm and it was inviting, and that you could hear the tinkle of laughter and people eating and drinking, somehow, despite whatever inhibitions you might have at the outset, you were just drawn in. It's been like, in a sense, being on the fringe of, let's say, an argument, not even an argument, maybe a joke, where it's animated, it's interesting, it's a bit provocative, and you can see people moving and they respond in different ways, and you just feel yourself leaning in, just getting a bit closer. It's almost like going into a cluster and there's a joke and people are laughing hysterically, and you start laughing as well, even though you've got no idea what the punchline is. Now, and I'm sure you would as well, yeah, and it's difficult to stop yourself. And I think, in a way, when you are, in a sense, a part of the goodwill, and obviously this couple you were referring to in the restaurant were spreading goodwill, both to themselves and obviously to the wider restaurant, which is why you went over in the first place. I think, in a sense, it has an infectious quality. And people like to do it more and like to experience it more. But the fear of doing things wrong, the fear of being marginalized, the fear of being excluded, the fear of being mocked, rejected, laughed at, it's very, very powerful. And therefore, it becomes easier just to do nothing, or even worse, to retreat into a kind of bubble. And one thing I've actually learned, quite interesting, talking about people going out for dinner and having a great time and doing it very publicly. I was talking to somebody a little while ago who's involved in the restaurant business. And he said, business actually is very good. The only difference is that today, my restaurant is relatively empty. But our takeaway business, our takeout business, phenomenal. Why? Because people would rather eat at home, behind closed doors, maybe in their pajamas, maybe watching a movie, whatever it may be. But the idea that actually out, maybe they get dressed up, maybe they take a different route, maybe they do something before, maybe they meet some friends when they're there, maybe they meet people like you, at least, who simply come up unannounced and sit down and enjoy the evening with them. But that doesn't happen. People secrete themselves away as if there's some kind of scary monster out there which is going to somehow diminish or undermine their evening, and therefore they rather eat behind closed doors and not engage with the world around them. And that, to my mind, is rather sad.
Yeah, let's fix that. Let's grab our first break and we'll talk more about that. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We've been on the air with Howard Lewis, the host of the Offline Dinner Experience. We've been talking a bit about just the way he goes about life and plays. After the break, we're going to learn a little bit more about how these dinners actually work and a few other exciting, interesting things. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. As I am dedicated to helping create a world where people have fun in their everyday life and also realize their potential at work and are led by inspirational leaders that help them find and contribute their greatness. And ideally, we do business that betters the world. I keep researching and writing my own books. So my last one came out in 2023. It's called The Great Revitalization: How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. And I wrote it to help leaders understand the discerning needs of today's and wants of today's workforce. And then I provide 22 best practices to equip your organization to create that for them. You can find my books on Amazon or my personal site, elisecortez.com. If you are just now joining us, my guest is Howard Lewis. He's the author of Leave Your Phone at the Door. So let's talk about those dinners. I want to come to one of your dinners. I think I told you that I've partaken of Jeffersonian dinners, which are designed over a theme to get people talking and connecting, and there's rules around that. I know your dinners are not like that at all. Let's talk about where did the offline dinner concept come from and what's it like to go to one of them?
But the first thing to say is it'd be a pleasure to invite you. I haven't actually done a dinner for a while, partly because I just felt it needed a bit of a refresh, and partly because I want to get the book finished, which obviously I did last year. So that's something which is actually lying in the future, which I could easily resurrect, and whether I do it in Dallas or I do it in London or anywhere else actually is not an issue. Going back to your original question as to how it first emerged, I used to read very widely, all kinds of newspapers and periodicals in the day.
See that.
Hard copy. And I would often tear things out to read later. And I look at the pile sometimes and think to myself, there's certain my friends or associates would like individual articles. And I would send them off to people, often once, twice, maybe a bit more, and with no other purpose other than to say to them, in a manner of speaking, hello, I was thinking about you. That was all it was. Don't do anything. I'll ask you to report back. Read it, pass it on, do what you like. Anyway, feedback was always great. Nobody ever objected. Some people were very complimentary. Anyway, one day I met a friend of mine with a bundle of things to read, and he knew I sent them to other people, and he just simply wondered out loud what everybody else was getting. And I thought, why not just bring together a bunch of people, not a lot, probably no more than 15 or 20, have dinner, take a private room somewhere, share a few articles and see where it goes. It was a great success. And I realized two things at least. The first thing was that most people have a real appetite for information, for knowledge, and for insight. Really haven't got the time or the inclination, frankly, to distill the vast profusion of material out there. The second thing, probably more importantly, food is a great leveler.
Yeah.
And when you eat with people, you learn a great deal about them. Anyway, I hosted this dinner, and the feedback was great, and I was asked to do it again by other people, and it simply expanded. I have to say that I'm probably the most unprofessional professional you've ever had on the show, in as much as I didn't really ever have any kind of plan. It just somehow grew by word of mouth, organically. People recommended it, people brought their friends. I would do it very occasionally. I probably did no more in the early days, maybe one or two a year. It just expanded. And what I learned above all else is that wherever you go in the world, you will find that people are fundamentally the same, just a bit different. And there's actually far more that connects people than separates them. And I started to invite people really on a completely random basis. In other words, I really didn't care where people came from, how much money they had, which sector they were in, which car they drove. I wasn't interested in their income, their sexuality, their religions, with no interest in it at all. What I cared about very much, though, is that they were givers. They were interested in other people. They were curious about the world. And over the course of the evening, I would share a few stories just about the offline philosophy, which really centered around behavior and cultural taboos and stories about my life and people I'd met and various mishaps that befell me, but all the while, in a sense, introducing a very human element. And I would normally invite typically 30 people, give or take, round tables. So let's say 4 tables of 8. I liked everybody to be in their respective eye line. I want the room also to be very much, I like the room in a sense to feel as though it is very connected but separate. So people on different tables, but people get up and wander around, change tables as necessary, but not in a particularly organized fashion. I let it somehow find its own flow. And people came from frankly everywhere. Some people I knew very well, some people I never saw all my life. People brought friends, lovers, partners, associates, children, next door neighbors, people flying. I mean, I didn't really care. I really didn't care at all. Whether you were frankly 25, 45, 95, no interest to me, whatever. In fact, I can tell you, the age span over the many years I hosted offline was in fact 70 years. The youngest person I ever came was 16, and the oldest was 86. And that should give you and no doubt your audience a glimpse as to the breadth of offline. I just didn't care where they all came from. I trusted, in a sense, in the fundamental goodness of the people around me. And that once people found their flow, all bets were off. In other words, all those preconceived ideas about what might happen and what was going to be next all flew out the window. And I have to say, looking back, I never actually counted how many dinners. I must have hosted over the years, I don't know, 50, 60 dinners. I'm not even sure. I never kept a record, but a lot of people. Some people came many times and brought their friends, and it was wonderful in a way. Other people, they never saw again, but that was also fine. There's always an element of speculation to these things. And what I didn't want to do was to be limited by the idea that everybody's got to go in with a guaranteed positive experience. Sometimes the experience is what you make of it. I provided the tools. I find a lovely venue, the food's good, the company will be interesting. But really, you, at a certain level, have actually got to make a step forward yourself. And too many people are far too concerned with what may go wrong than may go right. And I'm going to quickly share with you stories. It comes to mind now. It touches upon a question which you actually posed in your bundle earlier. And I couldn't think of a good answer. You actually asked me whether there was any particular example of somebody whose life was transformed as a result. I couldn't think off the top of my head. No, not instinctively. But one thing I do remember very, very well in a slightly different context, but how somebody's perspective was changed through the course of a dinner. I got approached many years ago by a woman who ran a very successful outsourcing company, probably a business turning over 10 million, not insignificant. She said to me, look, I read about it, I'd love to come. I said, I know my business very well, but I feel a bit confined. I want to stretch myself in non-familiar areas, and I'd love to come. Now, I know this because she told me after the event. She said when she first got there, she was really scared. Really scared. She said, I was way out of my comfort zone. I didn't know anybody. I wasn't sure what was expected of me. Will people understand my accent? Was my conversation interesting? Did I have to stand up and perform? I mean, a million different things going through. Now, I knew that. And I put her on a table. People I just knew were quite sympathetic and warm and outgoing. Anyway, the evening kicks off and I share a few stories. People start mingling and eating and so on and so forth. Halfway through the evening, I see her at the other end of the room, a very animated conversation with 2 or 3 other women. As it happens, they've got another bottle of wine there, and she's having a great time. And I asked her about that. She said, oh, yes. How interesting, you should mention that. She said to me at a certain point in the evening, I suddenly realised I forgot to be scared. Forgot. Yeah, I mean, it sounds in a way it's what you say, but nevertheless, she said to me that all those fears, all those inhibitions, all those concerns just evaporated. Nobody frankly cared what colour her shoes were. Nobody cared about whether she tied a ribbon one way or the other. There was no consequence at all. People were very interested to find out what kind of person she was. She gained confidence of being in that environment anyway. The wine flowed, the laughter spread, and so somehow, bit by bit, all those fears very gradually slipped away. I like that.
It's just a beautiful story, Howard. Thank you for sharing that, because I do think it helps our listeners and viewers to understand, how could I embrace this? What could I do with this? And so I love that she really just forgot that she could be afraid, that she should be afraid. Let's just say a little bit, if we can, for our listeners and viewers who are hearing about this idea of an offline experience, an offline dinner. And now we're talking about an offline philosophy. Let's just say a little bit about what is the offline philosophy?
Look, offline, in very simple terms, is about embracing randomness and serendipity. That really is the core. I'm a great believer that if you display an open mind and a generosity of spirit, most people typically will respond in kind.
Yep.
And to my stories earlier on about meeting the little boy on the subway, to meeting the former public prosecutor in Brazil, these are all examples of somehow being alive to what's around you. Yeah. You can very easily find reasons to cocoon yourself away, whereby you're oblivious to sights, sounds, smells, unexpected people, opportunities. It could be anything, frankly. It could simply be a wonderful floral display, which you pass in a 10-second spell on the subway. And I think that there are too many people who are far too concerned about negative aspects of everyday life. And I think people lack confidence, they lack self-esteem, they're also a little bit lazy, they're very inclined to step back into their comfort zone or actually do what the majority of their peer group are doing. Because, of course, most people you see want to be part of something. They want to be part of a tribe, a group, a club, or whatever. Yep. And the fear of being excluded because you display behavior which is contrary to what everybody else is doing is a big step. It's a big step. There are 35 people that are turning right, and I say, yes, I'm going left. I need to justify to myself, what am I thinking of? What will they say to me next time? And you see, if you are governed by a greater concern about how you may be judged or you may be perceived, rather than actually the extraordinary thing you saw or experienced or understood, having turned left and taking maybe a slightly different route, how uplifting, how inspiring, how everything, frankly. And I just feel somehow that people need to just lose the fear. I think once upon a time, we were much more carefree. I think the problem with the technology today is it becomes very limiting. When I was a kid, we used to live near a big park, and I had 3 younger sisters, and my mother would say, weekend or holidays, go with your sisters, meet your friends, and say, well, here's £10, buy everybody a sandwich and a drink, and just come back when it's dark. And we all came back, nothing untoward, maybe a few bumps and bruises, maybe a few tears, but nothing of significance. Today, that's far less prevalent.
Right. Yeah.
And essentially, there's a book which you, I'm sure, are aware of, came out a while ago in America, called The Anxious Generation by a guy called Jonathan Haidt. And it's basically around how social media and personal technology has had a devastating impact, particularly on teenagers. In his case, his premise is that young girls, because they're more visually competitive, have suffered even more. But one thing he said, which I hadn't appreciated before, and I think touches upon this theme in a wider sense, it's not so much the fact that the technology is the problem. There's been a societal breakdown over the last 50 years. What he referred to, which I was aware of, but not quite so much detail, in America in particular, in the 1980s, women entered the workforce for the first time in significantly larger numbers than before. And what that meant, of course, was that many children were left unsupervised at home. Yep. And because parents became more and more risk averse, particularly in America, that some terrible thing would happen, children did not have the freedom to go out, just go around the corner to the store, go for a bike ride with their friend 3 doors away. Things that they done ordinarily, but with a parent not being around, they stayed in their room, they watched TV, they played video games, they didn't somehow interact, they didn't engage, they didn't learn how to somehow be children and make mistakes, learn along the way. And that's a problem in a way which has become more and more pervasive. I think the fear that some terrible thing is lurking around the corner, which is going to destabilize your life, cause you great pain or distress. And I just feel, taking more of a chance. Nothing is guaranteed in life. I could drop dead tomorrow. I hope I don't. But nothing is guaranteed. And I think that one needs to live a little bit more in the moment, rather than plotting and planning, preparing and analyzing. I don't think it's healthy. I don't think it's healthy for young children. Now, put to one side social media, which is a separate issue, but the real issue here, I think, is that the technology itself is not the problem. The technology simply accelerated the problem. Yeah. And I don't think there's enough effort on the part of either educators, parents, governments, regulators, a whole lot, actually protecting children and ensuring they have the ability to lead what I would consider a relatively normal life.
Yeah. Here. Let's grab our last break and let our listeners and viewers chew on that, because there's a lot you just gave there, Howard. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We're on the air with Howard Lewis, the host of the Offline Dinner Experience. We've been hearing about his offline philosophy and really the joy of being able to embrace serendipity and randomness. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. I mentioned in the last break that my latest book came out, The Great Revitalization. What I did for you to accompany that is I created a simple 3-page free organizational assessment you can pull off my website at gusto-now.com. And that will help you determine the extent to which your current company's leadership and culture meet the standards of today's discerning workforce. If you are just joining us, my guest is Howard Lewis. He's the author of Leave Your Phone at the Door. So I can't help it because you are kind of in the dark here on the other side of the screen there. And it's okay. Don't worry about it. We can see you, but you are sort of in the dark. Have you ever heard of the concept of dîner noir, where you literally are dining in the dark?
No, but I'm very adaptable and I can take on almost any assignment. If
I think you would be the perfect dinner companion to go with to enjoy that experience, Howard. So we're going to make it happen. Okay. Dîner noir, where we actually eat in the dark. And the idea is that it just heightens your other senses and allows you to really focus on what you're eating and who you're connecting with. And you remove the visibility piece of it. And then on the other side, there's a concept called dîner en blanc. So literally it's a gathering where everyone wears white. They all bring, have you ever heard of dîner en blanc?
I have heard of that, I think, yes.
Yeah, I've never been, but I'm going. But the idea is that it's organized, that you find out at the last minute what the location you're supposed to go to meet everybody, and you contribute, you bring the meal, everything, the dishes, the tables, everything, all gets contributed by the people that are coming, and they create it together. Probably has some, there is planning for sure, but some randomness as well that I think you would probably really love. And then somebody might be bringing a harp or something to play or something along the way. But then at like midnight, a bell goes off and everybody jumps into action, cleans every single last morsel and all the evidence up and away, and they leave as if it never happened. I just think it sounds delightful.
Yes, it does. It does. I mean, I don't know how big it is, how many participants there are.
It could be several hundred people.
That's a lot of people. Okay, that's a bit different. I think, when you've got that many people, you can't really achieve the intimacy which I think a lot of us crave. I think obviously it's wonderful to be part of that kind of experience, but never, as I think what matters most of all is to have a kind of physical closeness. And I think that's very important indeed. I think, the events you talk about, and indeed the actual idea of a Jeffersonian dinner, which I didn't know about either, is very, very carefully choreographed.
It is, yes.
And Adolf Line, I didn't really worry about that kind of very much. I mean, I'm very unstructured in some ways. In some ways it's good, some ways not so good. And I really, in a way, allowed the cards to fall in a rather kind of random way. I didn't really think, well, hang on, what did I do last time, or what do I see more or less of? I just felt out, let the room find its own rhythm. Mm-hmm. What I did do, which is very important indeed, though, and this was key to all the dinners I hosted, I gave people permission to be vulnerable. Yeah. I started at the outset by saying, look, okay, I've normally organized a dinner and brought everybody together, but I can assure you, despite that particular ability, I am reliably hopeless at most things. But so what? Let me just give you a scorecard here. We all have different strengths and weaknesses. I can say I'm reliably hopeless at a number of things, but so what? I don't sit there agonizing over it or lying awake at night thinking, well, I could have done better, or somebody beat me at the last minute. But then again, I'm not very competitive in that regard. And I think a lot of people, sadly, are very competitive with themselves first and then the world around. And that's very draining after a while, draining on you as an individual, draining people actually around you. And I just found that if you allow a little more flow, you give people room to breathe. I think sometimes people are very intense and they're very, very pronounced and they're very urgent, and somehow there's no sense of just allowing somehow an idea to settle or change your mind or think about it or bring somebody else into the conversation. I think this fear of showing some kind of weakness has become almost a blight on many potentially interesting conversations. And I just never worried about that terribly much. And of course, you have to remember, as offline, it spanned the spectrum. So people came from frankly everywhere, whether they were involved in banking or they were in tech or they were in politics or they were in fashion, whether they were a librarian, whether they were a dentist, whether they were a retiree, whether they were an academic. I really didn't care. I mixed it all up. Sometimes I knew people, I thought they'd gone quite well. Other times I took a chance and let Kismet play its part. And some people formed close relationships, some people personal contacts, some people did business together, but I never really followed up. It wasn't that kind of a gathering. I know there are some people who bring people together and somehow there's got to be a consequence. And I didn't worry about that. Somebody put it to me very, very well many years ago. Somebody came to a few dinners and she said to me, one of the reasons offline works actually is because there's no agenda and there's no outcome. Just bring together 30 odd people in a room, lovely setting, good food, wine flows, good company, not too long, not too late, not too expensive. And that actually is about it. I can't claim that I invented something remarkable. I can't say that people were transformed as a result of attending. On the contrary, but I gave them permission to be vulnerable. I allowed them to be themselves. Nobody actually cared, frankly, whether you were inclined to a particular political belief, or whether you dressed in a particular fashion, or maybe you had a rather strange predilection for, I don't know, ornithology, whatever it may be. It doesn't matter a great deal. I just found that if you give people permission to be vulnerable, everything is possible. And that really was the key. And the book, in a way, was the culmination of many things I'd written, you see. And I've written many things, articles in St. Paul, stuff at the press over the years, but never a book. And people kept driving me mad about it. So I thought, yes, I'll just start. I'll start compiling it. And I did it a rather haphazard fashion. The problem for me, partly at least, was that I started it before COVID. And I actually was approached by different publishers, two in particular in the US, one in the UK, and then COVID turned my life upside down on a variety of ways. I always didn't have the mental bandwidth to get back into the manuscripts 2 years on, whatever it was. In the end, my girlfriend basically cajoled and sort of, should we say, encouraged me to get back, because she said it wasn't going to write itself. So I said, funny enough, about a month or so after getting back into the process, I got approached by another publisher out of the blue. Actually, it was Radius, and who I signed a deal with. So, in a way, it was a good thing, because I had time to think and to consider what I'd done before and how I coalesced the whole. But the fact of the matter was that I didn't sit down and write a book on page 1. Sort of I started on page 103, and then suddenly I was on page 43, and then it was 164. But somehow it was a question of piecing it all together from multiple sources. And that, for me, in a way, was interesting, kind of challenging in some ways. And of course, there were some stories I couldn't remember actually putting down paper ever. In fact, there were many stories which were just in my head. I just shared what I knew, what I remembered, and I wove them all together on whatever subject. And there were many things I talked about, whether it was to do with life around us, whether it was about the art world, or football, or travel, or food. It didn't matter a great deal. But all the while, the most important thing of all, people had a fabulous time. That's why I care that, really. There was no consequence afterwards. And because of that, I think, in a sense, for a lot of people, it gave them freedom. There wasn't a sense somewhere, okay, I've got to, write a report or an essay, or I've got to take a survey afterwards, or I've got to somehow justify the use of my time. On the contrary. And I just like the idea you can bring people together who have no prior connection, and they find common ground all over the place. And it's going to, many years ago, somebody came to a dinner who I didn't actually know very well. He was a business guy, and he before the dinner, normally 3-4 days, I send a reminder to all the attendees just to make sure they're all coming, they're all paid. Somebody have particular dietary requirements. So yeah, I sent a note through. This guy had obviously gone through every single email, looked at everybody's profile, worked out who was useful to him. He had a printed list of probably 10 names in his pocket. And when he arrived, he showed it to my girlfriend to say, by the way, people here, you know them, maybe I have a chat with them. She said, great, come with me. Took him to somebody who was not on the list at all. Somebody was like a ballet dancer, somebody completely removed from his day-to-day business. Anyway, evening progresses. He goes home. He sends me a note after, said, by the way, love the evening. Actually, I had a great time. Just want to mention to you, I get home, I get undressed, I'm emptying my pockets. What do I find inside? I find that very carefully creased list of 10 people who I earmarked beforehand as being useful to me or my business. Forgot all about it. Just forgot. And I met other people, whether they were ballet dancers, or they were engineers, whatever it may be. But somehow the idea you simply take a chance, I have to say, is a good thing. Now, I'm not opposed to technology. I want to make that very clear to anybody listening. I'm not anti-online. The problem in a way is the excessive reliance upon it has caused people to forget a lot of the basics. Now, you touched on something in your notes before. Simple ways of engaging with people. I tell you the simplest way of all, it's incredibly powerful, incredibly effective, and incredibly simple. Smiling.
Yeah.
Smiling, at least, is an incredibly powerful emotional tool, far more powerful than any app you have on your phone. The idea you looked, you stopped, you paid attention, you shared in that 1 or 2 second moment, goodwill.
Yeah.
That's all. Now, not difficult. It's not as people say, well, I'm not sure about that. I'm going to have to go and study how to do it. No, of course not. It's a very natural way of engaging. Or just the notion of saying to people, thank you, or please, or open the door open for somebody. Not difficult, but it's a very small way of saying to somebody, I care. And that really is it. So I don't have any kind of, there's no master plan with offline. I didn't really intend it in that way at all. I didn't think, well, hang on, here's a 6-point plan you can all follow to lead a more compassionate life, or to somehow find your true self, or, I don't know, discover a new plane which you hadn't considered before. None of that. None of that at all. And the book, in a way, is partly a reflection of that rather random approach to life. And things I wrote about, once you read the book yourself, do reflect that. And some of them I wrote for a purpose. I wrote for a publication, or they were maybe stories I shared at the dinner. But all the while, they were about essentially exploring the human condition. And the human condition is endlessly fascinating. And obviously, we are talking about it from the perspective of Westerners. Clearly, there are many ways of living your life if you are in Asia or you're in Africa or wherever else it may be. Depends on your realm of expectation, obviously your circumstances. But I just feel, going back to my earlier point, wherever you go in the world, you will find that people are fundamentally the same, just a bit different. And I just find that if you seek out points of convergence rather than divergence, you'll often be surprised on the opposite. One thing I mentioned also in the book somewhere, just the notion of being in a cafe, queuing up for a coffee, and just offering to buy one for the person behind you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Why? Why not? And it costs you, what's it cost you? $3, $5, whatever it may be. And that small act of goodwill may be shared by that person with somebody else. And where that person helps an old person across the road, or helps you with your shopping, or somehow, I don't know, steps in at last minute to fix a problem for somebody, doesn't matter a great deal. But I just feel that all the while, small things make a very big difference. You don't need grand statements. You don't need to make big projections. I think the small stuff, which makes us human, has been forgotten. And the phone, sadly, has become almost a kind of protective sheet. It's like looking at mesh. So you can see through the real world if you really look carefully, but it's not obviously available in front of you.
Yes, and that is a great way to finish. As we are out of time, Howard, I think that is a great way to finish. And I want to celebrate the intimacy that is available everywhere in life if we will just go and lean into it. I want to say thank you for coming on Working on Purpose, for writing your book, for hosting your dinners, for being you and gallivanting through life the way that you do, Howard. It's wonderful to know you.
Thank you for having me, and love to have another conversation on another occasion.
Sounds good. Listeners and viewers, you are going to want to learn more about Howard Lewis, his offline philosophy and dinner experience, and his latest book, Leave Your Phone at the Door. The best way to find him is on LinkedIn, and you can find him by his name, Howard Lewis, and you can notice it'll probably say, you'll know that you've got the right one, it'll say offline somewhere in there. See you next week for another nourishing and elevating conversation. And remember, work is one of the best means of realizing our potential and having an adventure and making the impact we crave. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune in to Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.